This is it, yeah.
Aaron Rodgers just confirmed he's walking away from the NFL. But before leaving, he spent years exposing what he believes is really wrong with the league. And now, with retirement looming, people are realizing he may have been revealing the NFL's secrets all along. This is it, the press conference that confirmed the end. The setting was an ordinary one. It was the third day of organized team activities, players in helmets and shorts, no pads, no stakes. Reporters gathered around a microphone, and Aaron Rodgers, the 42-year-old quarterback now wearing Pittsburgh black and gold, took questions for about 13 minutes. Most of it sounded like any other offseason availability. Then came the question that turned the session into news. A reporter asked whether he believed this could be his last year, whether he even allowed himself to think about it. Rodgers answered without hesitation.
This is it, yeah.
2 words. That was the moment that traveled across every NFL outlet within minutes. After more than 2 decades, 4 MVP awards, and a Super Bowl ring, Rodgers had finally placed a clear endpoint on his career. He did not announce it through a long letter, a documentary trailer, or a sit-down interview. He said it in passing in response to a routine question on a Tuesday in May. The build-up to those 2 words started months earlier. Rodgers had signed with the Steelers for the 2025 season, and even then he had hinted the clock was running down. He had previously suggested he was pretty sure his time was nearly up, yet the situation in Pittsburgh kept shifting in ways that pulled him back. When the same reporter pressed earlier in the session about whether there had been any doubt that he would return for 2026 at all, Rodgers admitted there was.
Yeah, there was some doubt for sure, but I had good conversation with Mike, going back to when he was hired.
That name Mike sat at the center of nearly everything Rodgers said that day. Mike McCarthy, his former head coach in Green Bay, had just been hired to lead the Steelers. The decision-making process, by Rodgers' own account, ran through a string of conversations with McCarthy, with general manager Omar Khan, and with his wife. He explained that he was not under contract, which meant he could take as long as he wanted to decide. He told McCarthy, Khan, and team president Art Rooney too from the start exactly where his head was. And then, after the NFL draft, he reached his conclusion. He wanted to play 1 more year. The why behind that conclusion was layered. Part of it was the roster. Rodgers pointed to the additions the Steelers made, bringing in Michael Pittman Jr., the running back Rico Dowdle, defensive pieces and draft picks that filled needs at offensive line and slot receiver. He felt the team had been close the year before and had added the right pieces. Part of it was his body. He had broken multiple bones in his arm and wrist during the 2025 season, and he wanted to see how those injuries healed once he stopped getting hit every week. When asked how much the physical recovery factored into his calculus, he said plainly that it was a big part of it, but the emotional core of the decision was the reunion. Rodgers described sitting in the first 8 o'clock meeting on a Monday and being transported back nearly 20 years.
Took me back to being a 22-year-old kid, sitting in Green Bay listening to Mike's first meeting in 2006, so it's fun. I mean, it's like a pinch me moments.
He listed the familiar faces around him: James Campen, a close friend of 14 years, Jari Evans, a former teammate now on staff, coaches he had known from his Green Bay days. He talked about the strength staff he loved, about the team chemistry built at training camp in Latrobe, about sharing a dorm bathroom with a teammate. He even said the part of the schedule he was most looking forward to was returning to Latrobe.
But I'll tell you one thing I really am excited about, and that's going back to Latrobe. And that's no BS. I can't wait for that.
There was even a lighter exchange about his time off the field. Reporters had seen video of him getting ice cream over the weekend and asked what else he had been up to since arriving in town in early May. Rodgers deflected.
I'm not going to tell you what I do in my personal time. You already saw I went to that ice cream spot.
So the headline was set. Aaron Rodgers would retire after the 2026 season, closing out a career that began in 2005. The announcement itself was calm, almost casual. But the man making it has spent years saying things about the NFL that were anything but calm. And to understand what he revealed about the league before walking away, you have to look at everything that brought him to this podium in the first place. The long road to Pittsburgh in the McCarthy full circle. To grasp the weight of that quiet, "this is it," you have to rewind through one of the most winding career arcs the modern NFL has produced. Aaron Rodgers did not simply play football. He wore the position like a second skin for the better part of a generation, and every chapter of that journey fed into the decision he finally made in front of those microphones. The story began in Green Bay, where Rodgers spent 13 seasons under Mike McCarthy, and together, the two of them captured a Super Bowl title in the 2010 season. Those years forged a bond that clearly never dissolved, no matter how many miles or years separated them afterward. When Rodgers described his return to McCarthy's orbit, he reached repeatedly for the same phrase, a full circle moment, the kind of poetic symmetry that an athlete chasing a meaningful ending would treasure. he had encouraged Khan to interview McCarthy in the first place. He admitted, almost as an outside thought, never genuinely expecting the franchise to follow through. The modern coaching carousel, after all, tends to spin toward the disciples of Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, and the brightest young offensive minds, not toward a veteran whose resume stretched back through Green Bay and Dallas. Yet the Steelers did follow through, and the moment McCarthy's hiring became real, something shifted inside Rodgers. He had arrived in Pittsburgh for the 2025 season largely because of Mike Tomlin, and when Tomlin stepped away after a wildcard playoff loss, Rodgers genuinely believed his own time with the franchise had reached its natural conclusion. He spoke of Tomlin's departure as a heavy, emotional moment, the kind that closes a door. The hiring of McCarthy reopened it, swinging it wide enough for one final walkthrough. What makes this homecoming so compelling is the contrast it offers against the turbulence that defined Rodgers' middle and later years. There was the bruising standoff with the Packers front office after the team drafted quarterback Jordan Love in 2020, a decision that left Rodgers feeling blindsided and disrespected, sparking trade demands and a public chill between the star and team president Mark Murphy. There was the brief, injury-shortened odyssey with the New York Jets, a chapter that opened with sky-high expectations and collapsed almost instantly when he tore his Achilles 4 snaps into his debut. By the time he reached Pittsburgh, Rodgers carried the accumulated wear of a body that had absorbed 2 decades of punishment, the scar tissue of front office battles, and the weariness of an athlete who had answered the same retirement questions every single offseason. That fatigue threads through everything he said at the podium. At 42, turning 43 in December, with a Hall of Fame plaque already guaranteed, the calculus of returning had nothing left to prove on the stat sheet. He had spoken in earlier years about wanting to enjoy the game with what he called love, fun, and peace, framing his final act not as a desperate grasp for more glory, but as a deliberate, soul-driven choice. He had even said, when he signed the year before, that decisions made out of ego left him empty, while decisions that rose from his soul nourished it. And when a reporter quoted that philosophy back to him, he leaned into it, describing the encouragement he gave to bring McCarthy in as exactly that kind of soul-led instinct. The roster only sweetened the temptation. Rodgers spoke with the measured optimism of a man who has learned not to overpromise in May, repeatedly cautioning that helmets and shorts reveal nothing about what happens once the pads come on. Yet he could not fully hide his excitement about pairing Pittman with DK Metcalf, about the offensive line addition, about the defensive reinforcements. He had even flown to Southern California to throw with Pittman, a quarterback's instinct to build chemistry before the calendar demanded it. And underneath the football logistics ran the human current, his wife. He named her conversations as central to the decision, the private counsel of a partner weighing in on whether one more season was worth the cost. Rodgers had grown increasingly philosophical in his later years, drawn toward personal growth, documentaries, and unconventional pursuits, and that broader life beyond the gridiron now beckoned with real gravity. The man who once seemed defined entirely by the game was openly contemplating who he would be without it. So when he sealed a 1-year deal to return for a farewell run, it was not a gambler doubling down. It was a veteran arranging the most comfortable, most familiar, most controlled possible stage on which to take his final bow. And that careful staging is itself a clue to everything he had grown frustrated with about the league he was leaving. What he said about the game itself. Because here's the part the retirement headlines tend to skip. Aaron Rodgers has spent years describing an NFL he believes has drifted away from what made it great, and those criticisms form a coherent, pointed indictment when you assemble them in one place. Start with the schedule. During the 2020 negotiations over a new collective bargaining agreement, Rodgers emerged as one of the loudest skeptical voices in the room. He openly wondered how a 17-game season got into the conversation at all, arguing that an extra game had never been part of the preliminary framework and that it dropped a fresh, high-risk contest onto players' bodies for what he considered insufficient return. He went after the players' union directly, charging that the NFLPA had failed to stand firm on the issues that actually mattered: revenue sharing, long-term safety, while accepting concessions that struck him as trinkets. The relaxed marijuana policy, which eliminated suspensions for positive tests while keeping fines, was not, in his view, a fair trade for a heavier physical burden. He floated a counterproposal that revealed how seriously he took the safety dimension, stretched the campaign across 18 weeks with 2 bye weeks rather than cramming in another collision-filled Sunday. Good enough, he insisted, should never be a phrase that creeps into negotiations over players' health and livelihoods. It was a remarkable stance for a marquee quarterback, a former union representative, public publicly chastising his own leadership, and his dissent helped push the eventual ratification vote uncomfortably close. Then there is the texture of the game on the field, where Rodgers' frustration sharpened into something almost philosophical. He aligned himself with Tom Brady's complaints that modern rules had diminished the sport, agreeing that the changes had made the product less than it was. His argument cut against his own interests, which is what made it so striking. Here was a quarterback protected by an ever-thickening rulebook complaining that those very protections had cheapened the competition. He contended that the modern environment allowed careless throws to escape punishment because defenders no longer dared to deliver the big hits that once policed sloppy quarterback play. The result, in his telling, was the breeding of bad habits and the erosion of defense as a craft. He has gone further still, describing a league sliding towards something resembling flag football and tying that drift to what he framed as a broader softening of society. The whistle-happy roughing the passer flags, the inconsistent officiating that punished defenders for the offense's mistakes. He believed the rules governing quarterback protection were heading in the wrong direction, draining the toughness and strategic depth that gave the game its texture. The irony was not lost on observers. The player most shielded by these rules was the one mourning their existence. His grievances grew more personal and more physical when the subject turned to the surfaces he played on. Rodgers became an outspoken advocate for natural grass over artificial turf, warning of the elevated injury risk that synthetic fields carry. That advocacy gained brutal, unavoidable weight when he shredded his Achilles on a turf field during his ill-fated Jets debut, an injury that immediately galvanized the NFLPA to renew its push for grass in all stadiums. He had voiced his preference for grass long before that catastrophe, acknowledging that some artificial surfaces were better engineered than others while maintaining that the safest, most consistent choice was the natural one. His public stance lent a powerful, recognizable face to the union's campaign, even as owners balked at the steeper maintenance costs that league-wide grass conversion would demand, and the complaints accumulated beyond those three pillars. Rodgers vented repeatedly about officiating, the missed pass interference calls on pivotal downs, the penalty-heavy contests, the sense that enforcement was at once too punitive and too inconsistent. He pushed for modified penalties and compensation during training camp, citing the physical demands placed on bodies that were not yet being paid for the regular season. Years of absorbing brutal hits, like the Anthony Barr collision in 2017 that broke his collarbone, kept the question of player welfare personal and raw. Taken together, this was not idle griping. It was a sustained argument from a man who had spent his career studying the game at its highest level and had concluded that the NFL kept choosing revenue and spectacle over the integrity and safety of the sport itself. That conviction, simmering for years, gives his decision to walk away a different flavor than a simple retirement. It reads almost like an exit on principle. The controversies, the culture wars, and the search for peace. Yet the criticisms Aaron Rodgers leveled at the game were only one half of the storm that swirled around him. The other half was the relentless, often self-inflicted controversy that transformed him from a beloved gunslinger into one of the most polarizing figures in American sports, and that exhausting transformation may be the quietest reason of all behind his desire to disappear from the spotlight. The defining eruption came in 2021, when Rodgers, asked whether he had been vaccinated against COVID-19, replied that he had been immunized, a carefully chosen word that later unraveled into the admission that he was, in fact, unvaccinated and following alternative protocols. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. He was fined, he lost sponsorships, and he was widely condemned across the media landscape for what critics called a deliberate effort to mislead the public. The episode detonated his broad, brand-friendly appeal and recast him overnight as a lightning rod in the culture wars. He would later express some regret over the precise wording, while continuing to defend the underlying principle of bodily autonomy. But the damage to his public image was done, and it never fully healed. From there, the controversies multiplied. Rodgers became entangled in a swirl of fringe associations and conspiracy-adjacent commentary, questioning narratives around major national tragedies, feuding publicly with late-night host Jimmy Kimmel after comments connecting Kimmel to the Jeffrey Epstein saga, flirting with the political world through his close association with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. His regular, unfiltered appearances on the Pat McAfee Show became a reliable engine of new headlines, each one drawing fresh accusations that he was using his platform to spread misinformation. He spoke openly about ayahuasca, about darkness retreats, about psychedelic journeys and personal growth. And while some admired the candor, plenty mocked it as the indulgent rambling of a quarterback drifting away from the sport. A running timeline of his controversies grew long enough that observers could chart his evolution from on-field icon to off-field provocateur, and outlets began publishing pieces explicitly built around the tension of loving and hating him at once. The friction was not confined to politics and podcasts. His relationships inside the locker room had long drawn scrutiny. Former teammates painted a portrait of a leader who could be exacting and selective, who had his favorite circle and held others at a colder distance, who would call players out in ways some found motivating and others found alienating. When his estrangement from his own family spilled into public view, it added a layer of personal coldness to the narrative. By the time he reached his later seasons, the criticisms from former Packers teammates and the lingering bitterness from the Green Bay front office divorce had hardened into a stubborn caricature of a brilliant but difficult man, one whose conflict with team president Mark Murphy had once spilled into public statements from the franchise itself. This is the context that makes his calm Pittsburgh press conference so revealing in its restraint. A man who had spent half a decade as a magnet for relentless scrutiny, whose name had drifted so far from football that some commentators speculated about his interest in national politics, had arranged for himself the gentlest possible ending. When reporters tried to coax him into talking about his personal life, he simply declined.
No, I just live my life.
That 5-word answer captures the whole arc. After more than 20 seasons, after the MVPs and the Super Bowl, and the endless headlines, the noise had simply stopped being worth it. The constant cycle of outrage, amplified by social media and a 24-hour news machine, had worn down a man who once insisted that doubters fueled his fire. The reunion with McCarthy gave him a nostalgic, low-drama refuge, a place to play football among old friends, far from the controversy, and then leave on his own schedule rather than being chased out by injury, decline, or one more public firestorm. So, did he really reveal everything? Now we arrive at the question the title actually poses, and it deserves an honest answer. Did Aaron Rodgers reveal everything about the NFL before walking away? In the literal sense, did he march to that Pittsburgh podium on May 20 and unleash a final scorching expose of the league's secrets? No, he did not. The press conference itself was, by Rodgers' own design, one of the most peaceful media sessions of his career. He talked about Mike McCarthy and the warmth of a coaching staff full of old friends. He talked about Latrobe, about ice cream, about West Coast offense terminology and route timing, about throwing with Michael Pittman in Southern California. The single biggest piece of news, his retirement, arrived in 2 understated words, almost as an afterthought to a question. There was no manifesto, no airing of grievances, no parting shot at commissioner or owners or rule makers. The man who walked away quietly. But that quiet is exactly what makes the fuller picture so interesting. And it is why the story is worth telling in full. Because while this specific press conference revealed very little about the NFL's flaws, Aaron Rodgers across his career has revealed a tremendous amount. He told us he believed the 17-game schedule was a safety risk forced through for money. He told us he thought the rules had watered the game down into something closer to flag football. He told us that artificial turf was dangerous, a warning his own shredded Achilles tendon underlined in the cruelest possible way. He told us he distrusted the league's COVID protocols, that he questioned the union's negotiating spine, that he resented inconsistent officiating. The everything in the title was not delivered in a single press conference. It was delivered in fragments, over 15 years, in CBA fights and Pat McAfee appearances in post-game pressers and locker room confrontations. So the most accurate way to read the title is this. The press conference where he confirmed the end was the period at the end of a very long sentence. The reveal was never going to be a dramatic final speech, because Rodgers had already said his piece, repeatedly, loudly, and across nearly every category of league business. What the May 20 session actually showed was a man who had made his peace with all of it, who had stopped fighting and chosen instead the comfort of familiar faces and a controlled goodbye. The contrast is the point. The same person who spent years as the league's most articulate internal critic chose to leave it not with a bang but with a shrug, an ice cream cone, and 2 words. And there is a deeper logic connecting the criticisms to the exit. The frustrations Rodgers voiced over the years, the extra game, the rule changes, the turf, the toll on the body, are not separate from his decision to retire. They are arguably the foundation of it. A man who genuinely believed the league was prioritizing revenue over player safety, who watched his own body break down on the surfaces he had warned about, who grew weary of both the physical grind and the public scrutiny, was always going to reach a point where stepping away made more sense than staying. The retirement is the conclusion that all those earlier complaints were quietly building toward. So when you assemble the full record, the calm press conference, the career of pointed criticism, the controversies that drained his appetite for the spotlight, the title holds up in spirit even if it overstates the drama of any single moment. Aaron Rodgers spent more than 2 decades telling us what he really thought about the NFL. The press conference where he confirmed his exit was simply the moment we realized he had already said it all. He did not need a grand finale, because he had been revealing everything the whole time. And now, on his own terms, in his own quiet way, he is walking away.